Have you ever wondered why the Vietnam War, a conflict that reshaped the globe, remains one of the most controversial chapters in history? What led the world's greatest powers to this small nation in Southeast Asia? And how did the echoes of this war change the course of millions of lives? In the next 15 minutes, we will dive deep into these questions, guiding you through the complexities and the untold stories. By the end, you'll have a comprehensive understanding of the Vietnam War, knowing everything you need to know. Part 1. The Seeds of Conflict. Imagine your playground getting taken over by someone else, and you want it back. That's how Vietnam felt after World War II. They were tired of being told what to do by other countries, especially France, who had controlled Vietnam for a long time. A man named Ho Chi Minh wanted Vietnam to rule itself, without anyone else being the boss. Ho Chi Minh and his friends, called the Viet Minh, fought against Japan, who took over during World War II. When the war ended, they hoped they could finally be in charge of their own country. But France came back, wanting to be in control again. This led to a big fight called the First Indochina War. In 1954, a big meeting called the Geneva Accords split Vietnam into two parts, the North and the South, like having two teams on the playground. The North was led by Ho Chi Minh, and they liked the idea of everyone sharing everything, which is called communism. The South didn't want communism and was supported by countries like the United States, who were worried about communism spreading. The United States started to help the South. They sent over soldiers to train them and gave them things they needed for the fight, thinking it would be a quick help. But it wasn't that simple. This help was just the beginning of a much bigger involvement by America in Vietnam. What started as Vietnam wanting to be its own boss turned into a much bigger struggle. It wasn't just about the playground anymore. It was about big ideas fighting against each other, with countries from all over the world getting involved. The stage was set for a much bigger story, one that would involve many heroes and many sad moments. But remember, every story has its heroes, its challenges, and its lessons. Stick with us as we dive deeper into this big story, understanding why people did what they did and how it all turned out in the end. Part 2. The big battle begins. Our story now takes us into a time when the quiet playground of Vietnam became the center of a huge and serious game. This wasn't like any game you've played before. It was about big ideas and beliefs, about who should make the rules on the playground. Imagine having a big, strong friend who comes to help you in a playground disagreement. That's what happened when the United States joined the South's team. They were really worried about a rule called communism spreading from Vietnam's playground to others around the world. They thought, if we don't help the South team, the game might change everywhere. So, the United States sent over a huge team of helpers, called soldiers, along with all sorts of equipment like big trucks, guns, and even airplanes that could fly really high and see far away. They hoped their help would make a quick difference. But Vietnam's playground was very different from what the American soldiers were used to. The jungles were thick and hard to move through, and the rivers could quickly become barriers. This wasn't a simple game of tag. It was a complicated struggle, with each side believing they were fighting for what was best for Vietnam. The North team, with help from their friends in countries like China and the Soviet Union, were determined to unite Vietnam under their own rules. They used clever tricks and knew the playground better than anyone, setting up hidden traps and moving silently through the jungles. Imagine trying to go about your day, going to school or playing outside, when suddenly your whole world is part of a big, scary battle. For kids in Vietnam, the war wasn't something they could just watch from the sidelines. It was happening right in their backyards, affecting their families, their homes, and even their schools. Despite the fear and the challenges, people found ways to support each other. Families shared what little they had, and communities worked together to keep everyone safe. It showed how, even in the hardest times, kindness and courage can shine through. All over the world, people were paying attention to the big battle in Vietnam. Many were worried and wanted the fighting to stop. In places far from Vietnam, people gathered to say, "Let's find a peaceful way to solve this." It was a time when the whole world seemed to be watching and hoping for peace. Sadly, the war is not over yet. The Vietnam War was a clash of different tactics and ways of using the terrain to gain an edge. Who will win? The enemy with the superior firepower, or the locals who are familiar with their surroundings? Let's dive into it. Part 3. The Fighting Styles of the Vietnam War. In the Vietnam War, the two sides fought in very different ways. The United States had a modern military with lots of technology, while the fighters from Vietnam used their knowledge of the land and clever strategies to their advantage. Let's dive into how each side approached the battle. The United States brought to Vietnam some of the most advanced equipment of the time. They had airplanes that could fly high above the clouds and see where the enemy was hiding, and helicopters that could move troops quickly from one place to another. American soldiers carried powerful rifles like the M16, which could shoot many bullets very quickly. They also had tanks that could move through difficult terrain, and big guns called artillery that could shoot shells over long distances. In the sky, jet fighters and bombers could drop bombs on specific targets they wanted to hit. The fighters from Vietnam didn't have as much technology as the United States, but they knew their home very well. They used the thick jungles, deep tunnels, and the landscape of Vietnam as their biggest helpers. This style of fighting is called guerrilla warfare, and it's like playing a giant game of hide and seek, where knowing the best hiding spots can give you an advantage. One of their most famous tactics was using traps like the punji pit, a hidden hole filled with sharp bamboo sticks. They also dug tunnels that stretched for miles under the ground, where they could hide during bombings and surprise their enemies from places they didn't expect. The dense jungles also made it hard for the United States to use their technology effectively. The thick canopy could hide soldiers below, and the terrain made it difficult for tanks and big vehicles to move around. This meant that even with all their equipment, the American soldiers had to be very careful and learn new ways to fight in Vietnam's challenging landscape. This war showed how important it is to understand not just how to use weapons, but also how to adapt to the environment and use strategy. Both sides faced tough challenges and had to make difficult decisions in the heat of battle. But even when everything seemed lost and hopeless, there still were heroes that helped and saved many. Who were they, and how did they do it? Stick with us and you will find out. Part 4. Heroes emerge in tough times. In the midst of the big, scary game of the Vietnam War, where it seemed like hope was hard to find, there were people who showed us what true bravery looks like. Let's meet some of the heroes who made a difference. First, there were the soldiers from both North and South Vietnam, as well as the United States and other countries, who risked everything. They weren't just fighting. Many were also protecting villages and helping kids and families stay safe. Then there were the doctors and nurses who came from all over the world to heal wounds and save lives. They worked in makeshift hospitals, under trees, or wherever they could. And teachers who kept teaching kids like you, making sure that even in war, learning never stopped. Let's not forget the ordinary people, the villagers who became heroes in their own right. Like the farmer who shared his last bit of food with hungry neighbors, or the teenager who helped younger kids find safe places to play and sleep. Being a hero didn't always mean being in the spotlight. It often meant doing small things with great love and courage. These acts of bravery and kindness remind us that even in the darkest times, light can shine through. These stories of heroes from the Vietnam War teach us important lessons about courage, compassion, and the power of standing up for what's right. They show us that anyone, no matter how ordinary they seem, can make a big difference in the lives of others. As we move forward, remember these heroes and their stories. Think about how, in our own lives, we can be brave and kind, just like they were. With every hero's tale, we learn something new about bravery and kindness. But what happens when the big game of war reaches a turning point? Stay tuned as we explore the moments that changed everything in the Vietnam War. Part 5. Turning Points in the Big Game. In every big story, there are moments that change the course of events, like chapters in a book that you can't put down. The Vietnam War had several of these crucial chapters, and each one teaches us something important. Imagine waking up to find out that a huge, unexpected game had started right in your backyard. That's what happened during the Tet Offensive. It was a series of surprise attacks by the North Team during Tet, the most celebrated holiday in Vietnam. Cities and towns, even those thought to be safe, were suddenly battlegrounds. This shock made many people, both in Vietnam and around the world, realize this game was far more complicated and would not be easy to win. Back home in the United States and in other places too, people started to say, "Enough is enough." They gathered in big numbers, holding signs and singing songs, asking for peace. These protests were powerful, showing the world that when people come together to ask for change, their voices can make a difference. It also showed that the war wasn't just happening far away. It was affecting people's hearts and minds everywhere. After many years of fighting and talking, both sides of the game finally came to the table for a serious chat in Paris. This wasn't just any talk. It was a promise to start winding down the war, called the Paris Peace Accords. Picture it as agreeing to stop playing a game that had gone on too long, with rules to help everyone get back to normal life. It was a big step towards peace, showing that even the hardest disagreements can find a resolution. The end of the war didn't mean everything was perfect. Soldiers came home, families tried to rebuild, and Vietnam began the long process of healing. This time also made people think deeply about the cost of the war, the importance of peace, and how we treat those who disagree with us. After those big changes, you might wonder, how did it all end and what happened next? The final chapters of our story are filled with hope, healing, and lessons for the future. Let's discover how the Vietnam War's legacy continues to teach us about peace and courage. Part 6. After the War, Finding Peace. When the loud noises of the war went quiet, the world seemed to take a deep breath. The Vietnam War was over, but now everyone had to figure out what comes next. How do you fix things after such a big argument? How do you make things right again? Imagine coming back home after a long trip, but everything feels different. Soldiers from America, Vietnam, and other places came back, but they carried inside them stories and feelings from the war that were hard to explain. They wondered, how can I share what I've seen and felt with my family and friends? In Vietnam, the land and people began to heal, like a scraped knee getting better, but still showing a scar. Families worked to rebuild their homes and lives, planting new seeds in their gardens and hoping for better days ahead. They also remembered and honored those who couldn't come home, keeping their memories alive. All over the world, people who had shouted for peace now spoke softly, remembering all those affected by the war. They built memorials, places where we can remember and learn from the past. It was a time to think about how important it is to understand each other and find peaceful ways to solve our problems. Families and friends tried to mend the hurt, writing letters, sharing stories, and sometimes just sitting together in silence. It wasn't easy, but bit by bit they began to weave their lives back together, finding joy in simple things like a meal shared or a game played together. The end of the Vietnam War asked a big question of everyone. How do we make sure we don't make the same mistakes? Teachers, parents, and even kids like you started to learn more about the war, not just to know the history, but to understand the power of kindness, bravery, and working together for peace. As we get ready to hear the last part of our story, remember that the war's ending isn't just about saying goodbye to the past. It's about carrying forward the lessons learned, about healing, and about making sure that every day, in small ways, we work towards a world where everyone understands and respects each other. Let's step into the final part of our story with open hearts, ready to discover not just how the story ends, but how it continues in each of us every day. Lessons learned and moving forward. The Vietnam War was a time of great challenge and change. It taught us about bravery, the importance of understanding different perspectives, and the power of standing up for what's right. Even though it was a difficult period, it also showed us how people can come together to heal and build a better future. Today, we remember the Vietnam War not just for the battles that were fought, but for the lessons it teaches us about peace. Memorials and museums stand as reminders of the past, helping us to remember the importance of working together to solve our problems without conflict. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Vietnam War. If you liked this video, like, comment, and subscribe. Also, feel free to check out the playlist and the other video that will appear on your screen now. Remember, history isn't just about the past. It's a light that guides you toward a better future.